Hello, my name's Laura Bennett and I'm the Policy Manager for Young Carers and Young Adult Carers at Carers Trust. And I'm here today with Philip Anderson from the Department of Health and Jenny Franks from the Children's Society to talk to you about the Care Act and the Children and Families Act and how those two acts of Parliament interact to make rights better for young carers, young adult carers and their families. We've been talking about new pieces of legislation, and I guess they are new, but they're not new as well in some ways. So there's the two pieces of legislation we're talking about are the Children and Families Act of 2014 and the Care Act of 2014. So both of those acts were passed by government in 2014, but they came into force on the 1st of April 2015 this year. And between them, they work together to create better and more consolidated rights for young carers, young adult carers and their families. And previously, those rights sat across 3 pieces of legislation and 6 pieces of policy and practice guidance, so these create a better, more unified framework. If it's helpful to remember how we got here, so a group of organisations called the National Young Carers Coalition, of which the Children's Society is part, came together to campaign to change the law. And in the top picture there, you can see a group of young carers who came to Parliament to talk to politicians about what was needed, so why that change in the law was needed. And in the bottom left, you have a picture of Edward Timpson, who's one of the Ministers of State at the Department for Education. And on the bottom right, you have Norman Lamb, who was the previous Minister of State for Care and Support. And so why this is important is because not only were 2 government departments coming together, the Department for Education and the Department of Health, but also 2 political parties were coming together in that coalition to make that happen. And of course, there was wider cross-party support for both of these pieces of legislation to go through. So I'll talk about the Children and Families Act first. So it's Part 5 and Section 96 of the Children and Families Act, which details the rights for young carers. So local authorities have got to assess what young carers in their area have support needs, and if so, what those needs are. And they can carry out the assessment if they think the child has got needs. So crucially, the young carer or their parent doesn't have to ask. That can be offered to the young carer and or their parent. And or if the child asks them to, or if the parent asks them to. So that increases rights for children and young people, which is really good. Local authorities have also got to take reasonable steps to identify young carers in their area who've got support needs. And whilst the Act doesn't define what reasonable steps are, it's not hard to see that that would include working with schools, for example. Carers Trust and the Children's Society work on a project called Young Carers in Schools, and there's other good practice work with schools. Could include disabled people's organisations, faith groups, community groups, youth organisations, those kinds of things. So reaching out to children and their families. In terms of what the assessment has to cover, all young carers under the age of 18 have got a right to an assessment of their need. And that's a really important change. So it no longer matters who they care for. So it could be a sibling or it could be a parent. Doesn't matter what type of care they provide. So whether that's emotional support, perhaps around prompting, around mental health or substance misuse, for example, or whether that's around a physical disability. And it doesn't matter how often they provide it. So it could be just 5 minutes of care a day, for example. But that's something that might be requiring some support or might be causing distress to the young carer. So the assessment needs to consider whether it's appropriate for that young carer to provide or continue to provide that care for the person who needs care, and also look at what the young carer's needs for support are, what their needs and wishes are. So in a sense, the young carer's own outcome. So what does the young carer want to get from this? In the assessment, the local authority's got to look at what does the young carer need for their own education, their training, what the Act calls recreation, so things like hobbies, having a life essentially, and work. So crucially, that's whether the young carer is in work or not, so having a focus on the future already, even when they're under 18. Assessments can absolutely be joint if everybody agrees, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the whole family approach later. But having a joint assessment isn't the same as doing a whole family approach to assessment. So for example, It's possible to combine the assessment of a young carer with the assessment of a disabled child if the young carer is providing child for a disabled sibling, or with an adult who needs care and support. But that's not the same as whole family approach. So one of the things we have heard, for example, is people saying, oh yeah, it's joint assessments because that's whole family approach. And those aren't necessarily the two same things. Reasons why it might be important to have some separate time in an assessment is because we know that it's hard for young carers to talk about what's going on at home, or it can be hard for them to talk about having what they need, what their needs are. It can be really hard to say, actually, I really don't like it when my mum's really depressed and I have to help her get out of bed, or those kinds of things. It can be really hard to say, I find it really hard when my dad's been drinking and I have to help him get to bed. That can be hard to say in front of the person that you care for. It can also be that it's potentially difficult for the young carer to think about what life might be like without the caring, and so it's another opportunity to talk to the young carer about what that might be like. The Act says who's got to be involved in the assessment, so pleasingly the local authority's got to ask the young carer what they think, and also the Act talks about the parent, but that would also be the person that they care for if that's not the parent, for their views during the assessment. And anybody else that the young carer or their parent would like them to ask. So that could be the young carer's best friend's mum or dad, for example, an aunt or an uncle. So somebody who knows the young carer and their family well. Could be a young carer support worker, for example. So somebody else, it could be a teacher, for example, it doesn't matter who that is. There's more detail about the assessment in the regulations that fall under the Act. So the assessment's got to be appropriate and proportionate to the needs of the young carer. So if somebody's 5, for example, there's not really very much point having a 5-hour assessment, for example. That's not going to really help anybody out. The local authority's got to consider what age the young carer is, what their understanding of the situation is, and what their family circumstances are. I mentioned those wishes, feelings, preference, so what the young carer is looking for. Crucially, are there any differences of opinion between the young carer's parents and the person being cared for, if that's not the same person? So obviously this isn't about what time is an appropriate bedtime or what constitutes a clean and tidy room. It's not those kinds of disagreements, but it is things like around, so for example, if somebody feels like that would be too much support for them, or if somebody would like to kind of talk about other things that are going on. And of course, this is something that can't really be legislated for. This is in very kind of sensitive practice work that social workers or contracted out assessments will be carried out with. And so that the assessment works well for everybody, before the assessment the local authority's got to give information about the assessment that means the young carer, their parent and or the cared for person, and anybody else who's going to be involved in that assessment can take part, and that information's got to be accessible. So that could be around language, but that could also be around easy read, for example, if there's somebody who has a learning disability involved with the assessment, so that that assessment can work as well as it possibly can for everybody else. Thank you. The Act doesn't define who the assessor should be. So in some Acts define that a particular profession has got to be the assessor. So it doesn't have to be a social worker or an occupational therapist, for example, but it's got to be somebody who's appropriately trained and who's got enough knowledge and skills to carry out that assessment, to do that practice work sensitively. And again, it's got to be appropriate depending on the young carer's circumstances. So this is something that a young carer and their family could ask for. So for example, the young carer might feel like it's really important for the person coming to do the assessment to understand that both my parents are women, for example, or that we want people to understand what it's like to be growing up in a Muslim family, something like that. So whilst that's not always going to be possible for every local authority to provide all different types of assessors, if that is possible, that's something that should be done. And the local authority has got to consider any other assessment that's been carried out, so either for the young carer or for the person who's being cared for. So it could be that the young carer is also a disabled child, or it could be that they want to consider an assessment that's been carried out for an adult, for example, as well, or for another child in the family. So there's more detail in the regulations about the assessment. So the assessment's got to look at how much care is being provided, what kind of care is that, or what will the young carer be intending to provide. So sometimes it could be perhaps, for example, someone's in hospital and they're looking at what care might be provided when someone comes out of hospital that the young carer might be going to do. how much would the care that the young carer would be doing or is doing relied upon by the family? So if it's a little bit, or is it if that young carer didn't do it, there would be nobody there to do it at all, to maintain the well-being of the person who's cared for? And what impact that care has on the young carer's well-being, education and development. And well-being has a very wide definition. It's similar to that provided under the Care Act. So it's looking at all sorts of things. And that's because young carers are children. So we have more of a responsibility to look after their development and their well-being because they're children. Crucially, whether any of the tasks that the young carer are performing or intends to perform are excessive or inappropriate for the young carer to perform. So particularly thinking about their age, their sex, their wishes and their feelings. And crucially, you can only work this out by doing the assessment. So it's not just about going through. So in the guidance under the Care Act, it has a sort of list of things that might be inappropriate or excessive, and certainly those are good things to be looking at. It doesn't mean that that is something that you can't assess. So what I mean by that is that it's possible to imagine two siblings in a family, child A and child B. Child A gets really anxious about having to remind their dad to take his medicine, and child B doesn't particularly get anxious about that at all. So rather than focusing on the actual task, it is about looking at the impact on that young carer. So the young carer who gets very anxious, what kind of support and reassurance can be provided for that young carer? After the assessment, the local authority's got to give a written copy of the assessment to the young carer and their parent and anyone else the young carer or the parent asks them to. This is, Carers Trust have been writing a rights guide for young carers and young adult carers, and this is something that when we were talking to young carers and young adult carers while we were developing it, this is something that caused quite a lot of anxiety. So what have I said during the assessment and how will that be presented back to my parent? And of course, again, this brings us back to that sort of really sensitive practice. So in the same way that it might happen during a safeguarding assessment, for example, you need to kind of look at what's presented back. And again, if a young carer is very worried about what might be said to their parent after the assessment, that might indicate a need for more support or possibly a safeguarding concern, although of course it's not the case to say that every young carer is necessarily a safeguarding case. And the local authority has got to decide, has the young carer got any support needs? Are there any services that the local authority provides which could meet those needs, and whether to provide those services if so? And crucially, this could include giving help to the person that the young carer cares for, so that the young carer doesn't have to do as much caring. So rather than sort of looking at the young carer and saying, oh, you're having a really difficult time, aren't you? Okay, well, we'll provide a support group for you for 2 hours a week. It's about, no, how can we remove that caring so that you don't have to do it? The support group, not that the support group's a bad idea, of course it could be a good idea, but it's not about just kind of sort of providing a patch or something to ameliorate that situation. And yes, so just a bit more detail about the regulations. So can any of those young carers' needs for support be prevented by providing services to the person cared for or another member of the young carer's family? So if support was provided to an uncle or an aunt, for example, would that make things better? Crucially, kind of essentially this is removing all of the needs for the child. So meeting all the needs for the adult and then looking at what's left for the child. So if what would the young carer's needs for support be if they didn't have to do any caring? What's going to happen as a result of the assessment, any arrangements for a future review, or what might happen if things get worse more soon? So perhaps it's agreed that, oh, actually things are in a bit of a crisis now, so we're going to meet again quite soon. Or perhaps it feels like things are a bit more stable and so meet again in a few months, for example. And also support the young carer and their family to identify kind of wider social circles, wider groups that can kind of come together and meet those things with them. Thank you. And now we're going to move on to talk about the Care Act and how that can support young carers to move on to adult services.
Right, so I'm Philip Anderson from the Care Policy team in the Department of Health, and I was involved in taking the Care Act through Parliament actually, and specifically in writing the statutory guidance around transition to adult services. So I'm here to talk specifically about the transition arrangement when someone is approaching adulthood. So the Care Act identifies 3 groups of people who the local authority has a duty to conduct a transition assessment for where they are likely to have needs for care and support as adults. So young people approaching 18 who have care and support needs themselves, young carers, so most relevantly today, and adult carers of a young person who is preparing for adulthood. So obviously young carers are the most relevant, but it's important to remember that families don't always fit into convenient legal categories, so there could be different members of a family in each of these groups at a given time. You have a duty as a local authority to conduct a transition assessment when there are likely needs, and to do so when it is of significant benefit. And it's important to emphasise that it's when it is of significant benefit. So as long as there are likely needs, you have to do a transition at some point, and the significant benefit test is about when exactly you do it. So partly that's about doing it when someone is old enough that you can have a clear idea of their needs as an adult, but it's also about doing it early enough that you have time to put in place a proper transition plan and have services in place when they actually transition to adult services. And it also encapsulates more detailed points. So for example, doing a transition assessment when someone is in the middle of revising for exams wouldn't be very clever in many situations. And it's important to emphasise that the test is if you have likely needs as an adult, either as a carer or as a person receiving services themselves, which means that not everyone who is eligible for transition assessment will necessarily be receiving services under children's legislation. So a good example would be someone with autism who does very well in school but may need a bit of support in a less structured environment. So may not be receiving children's services but may very well need some kind of transition assessment and the kind of support we're talking about. So the key requirements of a transition assessment are not coincidentally very similar to the key requirements for assessments under the Children and Families Act that Laura has already outlined. So the requirements are to be person-centred throughout, to take account of the well-being of the young carer, and as Laura mentioned, that's the same definition across the two acts, include any other person that the young carer would like, and to be appropriate and proportionate to the complexity of their needs. And what do you need to know by the end of transition assessment? You need to understand current needs for support and the impact of that on well-being. You need to be able to give someone an indication of whether they are likely to have eligible needs under the Care Act as an adult. And you need to have a clear picture of the outcomes that a young person or carer wishes to achieve. And we generally talk about that covering short, medium and long-term outcomes. So not only what do you want to get out of the year between 17 and 18 or between 18 and 19 or whatever it is, but what would you like to achieve in your life, and how can we think about working backwards from that long-term goal into a short-term kind of transition plan. So all in all, the Children and Families Act and the Care Act were deliberately designed as a comprehensive framework so that people can transition over time in a way that feels quite similar and focuses on the same kind of personalised, person-centred, outcome-based approach. And in both acts there's a new focus on carers, and the idea here is very much that families transition together rather than that you consider people in isolation. And it's important to note that the duties in both acts are on local authorities. So children's services and adult services are not actually legal entities. The only thing that we as government have the power to place a duty on is the local authority, which means that all kinds of operating models beyond the traditional children's services and adult services are possible. And we certainly know of people that have 14 to 25 or 16 to 25 kind of specific groups, and that can work quite well. You'll notice the significant benefit test does not say anything like you must begin transition planning at 14 or you must begin transition planning at 16, and that's a conscious decision that the transition point will be different for different people. But the Education, Health and Care plans under the Children and Families Act have a duty to begin thinking about transition planning at 14. And what we say in the statutory guidance under the Care Act is that that's a good default position for transition planning generally. So if you'd like some further information, the Care Act Statutory Guidance, Chapter 16, it's about 20 pages and sets all this out in a bit more detail. The Social Care Institute for Excellence has also produced a really good resource map that has a lot of specific pieces of guidance about transition for different groups, such as children with life-limiting conditions is one example, and with autism is another example. And also specific guidance on transition for young carers and actually for adult carers, as those are sort of more new compared possibly to young people themselves. And lastly, Skills for Care has produced Train the Trainer material, which is designed to kind of embed this as practice in local authorities. And lastly, I just want to say a little bit about what young carers can expect as adult carers under the Care Act, which will be familiar to many of you, so I won't dwell on it. But we've talked about the transition. Local authorities have a general responsibility to assess a carer's needs for support where the carer appears to have such needs. So we've removed the previous substantial and regular test, where you only had to do an assessment if someone was doing substantial and regular caring. And a carer's assessment under the Care Act has very similar requirements to transition assessments and young care assessments that we've already talked about. So I think that's it for me.
Okay, so following on from Laura and Philip, I am Jenny Frank and I am the Strategic Manager at the Children's Society for our work with young carers. And I'm just going to take you through 3 new documents that will help you put into practice the whole family approaches and the legislation that we've been talking about. So as we all know, the new legislation advocates a whole system, whole council and whole family approach, and for local authorities to adopt an approach which coordinates services and offers support around the person and their family, and as Laura said, considering the impact of the care needs on an adult in their family and including children. And threading through that is the principle of well-being. So the first document that I'm going to talk to you about is the Care Act and Whole Family Approaches. And this is relevant for everyone, not just for young carers. So it's talking about whole family approaches across the piece. But there are sections in there about young carers which I'm going to focus on today. I just wanted to emphasise again that about thinking whole family and delivering whole family is looking at the approach. So what are we doing already, but putting it in the context of the family? It is not a whole family assessment. So there isn't a tool out there that assesses the whole family. It's looking at where we're working from, where we're starting from, and making sure that we include the whole family. So this document has 4 key steps in it. Think family, get the whole picture, make a plan that works for all, and check that it works for the whole family. And in the document, each of these steps is followed by key practice points that local authorities should take into consideration when implementing a whole family approach. And there are also practical tools in it to aid implementation of whole family approaches to both assessment and care planning, which can be developed and used for local use. So it's a template for everyone to look at and to help them deliver their new duties under the legislation. So step 1, in a council that thinks family, they will make sure that they've got a change programme in place, and I know a lot of people are already doing it, so that their workforce is skilled and has the knowledge to understand how they need to reach out to these families and to deliver the right approaches. And on the ground, in step 1, they will be asking family-related questions and making sure that they're embedded in whichever process they're using at the first contact with that family. So simple questions such as who else lives in your house? Who helps with your support and who else is important in your life? And is there anyone that you provide support or care for? And is there a child in the family, including stepchildren, children of partners or extended family? And also, equally very important, is there any parent that might need support in their parenting role? So all good practice that we've all been talking about and delivering for years, but now it's enshrined in legislation and guidance. So step 2, getting the whole picture, means seeing each person as an individual, but recognising their role and where they fit within their family and their community. And making sure also that we recognise any strengths and any resilience that they've got as well. So, to actually see how they cope and to be able to build on that as well. It also means strategically that there will be a joint protocol in place between children's and adult services that makes everyone's responsibilities and accountabilities very clear and how services will work to deliver them. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. So in step 3, we'll be developing a plan that works for everyone. And again, we'll take into account the well-being of all the family and the impact of any services and support on any other family members. And that plans will be developed in a coordinated way and with a lead person taking responsibility for that. And through all this, we need to be mindful of some triggers. So if there is a referral for an adult with a care and support need, or a child with a disability with a care or support need, we need to be asking ourselves, who else is in the family? Is it a child? Might they be a young carer? And then talk to our colleagues in children's services. But equally, if the first entrance is working with a child and we identify a young carer, that should automatically trigger a review of the person who has the care and support needs. So about making sure that we think across the piece. And then last but by no means least is to actually make sure that it's working, to make its reviewed, make sure that everyone has a copy of the plan, and also to make sure that the systems and services in place are actually there to prevent or reduce a child undertaking inappropriate levels of care which might be impacting on their own well-being or their life chances. So something we've all been doing for many years as best practice, but now clearly set out in duties and responsibilities. So I'm now going to move on to talk to you about the next document, which is a Memorandum of Understanding developed by colleagues in the ADCS and ADAS and supported by the Children's Society and Carers Trust. And this is what I was talking about before. It's a joint working protocol. So it's a resource to help promote working together between adults and children's social care services, and also for collaboration and enhanced partnership with health and third sector partners. It's not a long document, it's very simple, and it offers links across to thinking about how we link to joint strategic needs assessments, how we link into health and wellbeing boards. It contains a shared understanding of what we mean and what we're talking about around young carers and whole family, and it addresses progress through transition, information giving and information sharing, and also the importance of being mindful of safeguarding. But threaded through it are some key principles of practice which actually underpinned the joint guidance, the guidance when it was being planned for both the Care Act and the Children and Families Act. And so there are 3 key principles of practice up on the screen. So starting point needs to be to assess the needs of the adult who has, or the child who has needs and care support, and then see what remains for supporting a young carer that the family has. So simply saying what we should be really doing is looking and making sure we've got the care package in the family for the person that has a care supports first, and then make sure that we're preventing the child from undertaking inappropriate levels of care, but they may still need support. They still might want someone to talk to, they might need to be having extra support at school, they might need to be signposted to a local young carers project, but always be mindful of the starting point. And here the second one is the trigger point. So presence of a young carer in the family should always trigger an assessment or the offer of assessment to the person needing care. And here we are, whole family approach again. It's key when assessing an adult needing care where there are children in the family. but also a whole family approach should be used whichever family we go into. And most importantly, I think, is to always be mindful of asking, why is the child providing care and what needs to change to support the family better? So the third document that I'm going to talk to you about was developed by colleagues in the Department for Education, but also ADAS and ADCS, and supported by Carers Trust and Children's Society again. And this is supporting information and is to be used in conjunction with the No Wrong Doors Memorandum of Understanding that I've just described to you. So this builds on the regulations and the guidance around the Children and Families Act and talks about good practice in assessing young carers. As its starting point, it's talking about ensuring that adults and children's services work together to offer young carers and their families an effective service, and to make sure that assessments of both the young carers and the people that they care for are intrinsically linked. And the legislation clearly allows local authorities to combine assessments, but we need to be mindful that a joint assessment is different to a whole family assessment. At this point, we also need to be mindful of colleagues in health, housing and the wider community that might need to be involved. Very, very important to make sure that we involve them, collaborate, and make sure that the family has a chance to share their needs with them. What we want to get away from is having one assessment after another where families have to keep repeating what they need. It becomes exhausting when you're not well and really not time effective for all our services and resources. So along the way, we need to recognise that each child is a unique person on their own journey to adulthood and maturity, and how can we best support them. And I think it's important here to recognise that we must be mindful again of that word impact. We talked with colleagues for a long time and with ministers about the importance of when we were defining a young carer, that it wasn't so much what they were doing, it was how they were feeling and how it was impacting on their own lives. And we do know, and there's a bit of a warning here, we do know that many young carers are quite rightly highly motivated to make a positive combination to their families. But we as professionals really need to take a step back and be able to work with that child and ask them how that caring role is impacting or limiting their own potential, and not accepting at face value what we might see when we first go in the door. So we then need to recognise their own individual developmental needs, and very important, as Laura said, to make sure that we have time with them alone so that they get a chance to share their own thoughts. So there may often be difference of opinion between what they're feeling and thinking and what their parent or their brother or sister is. And then we need to take, as I said earlier, we need to take into account the strengths of the family, as well as identifying any challenges that they might be facing. So all good practice that I know we're all very well aware of, but the difference now is that for years we've been asking for it as good practice. Now we have a duty and a responsibility to identify the impact on the child and what is happening in the family. And having spent years raising awareness of children being young carers, we really need to remember that they are children and they are children first, and how can we support them? And a whole family approach is here to help you do just that. To protect them from inappropriate caring and let them have the same life chances as their peers. So in summary, they're all online. 3 documents are there, very good reads, none of them very long, very useful for you to be able to put into place the legislation in both the Care Act and the Children and Families Act and take it forward out into your local communities. Thank you.
Before we finish, I just wanted to ask if there were any questions.
There's this recurring issue where you go out, you've identified a young carer, the practitioner then does a best practice principles, which is to identify the needs of the person being cared for first, but often that person does not want to be assessed, wants not to be identified by social services at all. I'm thinking particularly of young carers with substance misuse or alcohol issues, mental health issues. What would be the guidance in those sorts of scenarios?
That is a question that comes up a lot, so it's a good one to ask.
I think it's obviously very important that you work with the family to gain their trust. But there was another document that I didn't mention actually, which is the Working Together to Safeguard Children, which actually does address those issues. So I think it's for the professional to consider where they think there might be a safeguarding issue and where it's in the child's best interest that they actually do need to carry out that assessment. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the point about these bits of legislation, the Children and Families Act, is that it gives the young carer the right to an assessment. So it's important that the young carer has that assessment to look at what their needs are, even if the person they care for doesn't want any care and support. So substance misuse is a really obvious example. Some kinds of mental health are as well as some kinds of physical disability, which brings us back to that disagreement point. So the young carer might feel there are needs, but the family are like, no, we're okay. And so again, it does bring us back to that really sensitive practice work. But that shouldn't be a reason for a young carer not getting the assessment and support that they need. And another issue that's come up, which is slightly related, is can a parent refuse for their child to have an assessment of their own needs? And again, it brings us back to that really sensitive practice work, and potentially that it's not necessarily a safeguarding issue, but it might be. And it is around kind of, no, they can't, because it's the young carer's right to an assessment of their needs. And again, if we think about the really sensitive practice work that I know your colleagues undertake in safeguarding, for example, if people feel there's a safeguarding concern, if the parent says, well, no, I don't want you to, it doesn't work like that. And it's not that I don't want to conflate being a young carer with safeguarding issues, because they aren't necessarily the same. But it is around, what does that young carer need? What does that family need?
What are the rights of a young person who might care for a partner, but they're not part of that partner's family, if you know what I mean?
Well, I think in the context of the whole family is, what is your family? So that is their family. So there needs to be a whole family approach for that young carer and their partner. And if there are other family members that need to be involved, then that's set out in the guidance that I've just shared with you about how to involve other family members. So they're very much entitled to the same as they would be for any young carer.
I think it's also about bringing it back to what is it that the young carer needs, so they could have an assessment if that was something that they wanted. And again, it is bringing it back to that wider point. It's about what's the care that's happening, what's the support that's needed. Doesn't matter if someone doesn't live together, so if it's, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, doesn't matter. It's just around what is going on that family needs support with. And as Jenny says, it's thinking about the wider family. And so, teenage relationships and young adult relationships is just as important as a spouse of 25 years. It's, they're still important. So it is around looking at what's needed there and what support can be provided.
Yeah. And I think equally, on that note about thinking about the wider family, there are young carers caring for grandparents who may not live in the family home but may be down the road. So we do need to think about them as well.
I think it can also be an issue with sibling carers as well, that kind of, perhaps you don't live at home anymore with the sibling who needs care, but you still have needs, and so it can be, it can still be harder to concentrate at college or university because you're worried about what's happening with your sibling, for example. So that can be an example of where things can really change if you've been providing a lot of care for a sibling. And like any young adult, you want those opportunities, same as everybody else wants to get out in the world, get on, but kind of, what are those kind of things that you can have that would support you?
I wondered how the whole family assessment could and should ensure that information is exchanged in an appropriate way and that counselling, if necessary, is followed up, because the young carer may not have understood until the assessment what the implications were of the condition of their relative, i.e. that actually there was a downward path in terms of escalating needs for care and support. And I was particularly interested in the comments about sibling carers, because my son was a sibling carer and I didn't realise until he was an adult and what the impact was. I thought I was a good parent, but it made me aware of the importance of emotional support, but also the right information. And many sibling carers, a new study from the Family Fund, say that nobody ever explained their relative's disability or condition properly. So it's just really a question about the interface between health and social care and support for what may be some quite tricky discussions.
I think that's a very important question about siblings, and we didn't have time to go into all the guidance and the regs today, but the assessment for the young carer and the young and adult carer does talk about looking at their emotional well-being, and because we know for young carers that's often the hardest thing for them to talk about and to have it recognised. But I think where you're talking about the needing information on the illness or condition is equally important, and we all know that's best practice, but it is addressed both in the No Wrong Doors document where it talks about information sharing. I know that colleagues in health are also looking at resources and information to share. But I think it's very important that we ask the young person during the assessment what they know and what they need to know. So it goes without saying, really, if they're 5, they're going to need information in a very different way as they would when they were 15. But it's really, really important that we do remember that. So thank you for that question.
I think also that is a tricky practice question. I can see that there would be some cases, particularly around end of life, for example, where it could be that, you know, some of that would have to be explored really sensitively without, you know, that balance between giving the child the information that they need to know, or the young person that they need to know, with kind of what, you know, what which I guess is where that differences of opinion might come around kind of, you know, what could we share, for example. Yeah. Thank you.